Before Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, he prayed. But what he did in those moments, the actual practice, the interior shift that preceded the miracle, has been lost to modern Christianity. Not because it was hidden deliberately, but because it requires something most religious education no longer teaches a method. If you've ever felt like your prayers echo in space, like you're speaking into a void with no one listening, you're not alone. You were taught that prayer is talking to God, asking, pleading, hoping He might answer if it's His will, if the timing is right, if you're faithful enough. And when nothing happens, you're told it's because God said no, or your faith wasn't strong enough, or His plan is simply beyond your understanding. But here's what almost no one tells you. That's not what Jesus did when He prayed. When Jesus stood outside Lazarus' tomb, He didn't ask God to raise him from the dead. He didn't plead or bargain. Instead, John 11 records something extraordinary. Jesus lifted His eyes and said, "Father, I thank You that You have heard me." Notice the tense, past tense. He thanked God for something that hadn't happened yet, as if the miracle was already complete before there was any physical evidence. That's not a prayer of request. That's something else entirely. Go back through the Gospels and you'll see the same pattern before every miracle. When Jesus healed the paralytic in Mark 2, the text states that He saw their faith and then spoke. But between seeing and speaking, something happened that the Gospel doesn't name. When He fed the 5,000, He looked up to heaven first, not to ask, but to align. When He walked on water, Matthew 14 tells us, He went up the mountain alone to pray before doing the impossible. Before healing the woman with the issue of blood, He felt power move through Him. He didn't decide to heal her. He was already in a state where power could flow. There's a consistent sequence here: withdrawal from the crowd, solitude, an interior shift, and then power. The question no one asks is this: if Jesus gave plain instructions about how to pray, why does modern Christianity treat it as a mystery rather than a method? In Matthew 6, Jesus says something most people misunderstand their entire lives. He says, "When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret." You've probably heard that interpreted as advice about privacy. Find a quiet place. Don't be showy. Pray where no one can see you. And while that's true on one level, it completely misses what Jesus actually meant. The Greek word He used for room is Tameion. It doesn't mean a bedroom or a cupboard. It means an inner chamber, a treasury, a hidden place inside something. Jesus isn't giving you advice about an external location. He's giving you a map to an interior space. He's saying when you pray, go inward, into the part of you that exists beyond your thoughts, beyond your identity, beyond the noise of your conscious mind. Go into your inner room, and then this is critical. He says, close the door, not try to focus, not minimize distractions. Close the door, seal it, shut out the world of the senses, the mind's chatter, the version of yourself that's afraid and wanting and asking. Because the Father doesn't exist out there, somewhere listening from a distance. The Father exists in secret, in the inner room, in the place most people never access, because they don't even know it's there. And Jesus went to that place every single time before power moved through Him. This isn't speculation. It's a pattern. Every healing, every miracle, every moment where the invisible became visible followed the same sequence: inward first, alignment, silence, then power. But here's the problem. You were never taught how to go inward. You were taught to close your eyes and start talking, to think about God, to imagine Him listening, to hope He's paying attention. But thinking about God is not the same as entering the place where God is present. And that distinction is why the miracle stopped. Not because God stopped listening, but because the method, the actual practice of entering the inner room and closing the door, was gradually lost as Christianity moved from small contemplative communities to a religion of empire. You can't systematize silence. You can't standardize interior development. You can't train priests to guide people into a place many of them have never entered themselves. So the instruction remained in the text, but the practice, the how, faded from common teaching. What remained were rituals you could perform, prayers you could memorize, forms you could follow without ever developing the interior capacity Jesus was describing. The words stayed. The method was forgotten. So let me tell you what Jesus understood that's almost completely absent from modern Christian teaching. Prayer isn't about persuading God. It's about coherence. Let me say that again, because this is the turning point. Prayer, the kind Jesus practiced, isn't about convincing God to do something. It's about entering a state of alignment, where you and the source are no longer operating as separate entities, where your will and the Father's will aren't in conflict or negotiation. They're the same, where there's no gap, no distance, no division, just union. And from that place, when you speak, you're not hoping reality will change. You're recognizing that it already has. That's why Jesus spoke in the past tense at Lazarus' tomb. That's why he thanked the Father before the miracle appeared. Because from inside the inner room, from the place of complete alignment, the future and the present collapse into one. What you see with your physical eyes hasn't caught up yet, but in the realm of cause, in the invisible, it's already finished. So you don't speak from want. You don't speak from hope. You don't speak from the anxiety of asking. You speak from agreement, from alignment, from the place where the Father's will and your will are no longer divided. Listen to how Jesus himself described it in John 14:10. He said, "The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works." He's not taking credit. He's not claiming personal power. He's saying, I'm not doing this. The Father is doing it through me. And notice, he doesn't say for him or to him. He says through him. Jesus became the vessel, the doorway, the place where heaven and earth met. And he did that by entering the inner room and closing the door to everything that wasn't God, but only from that place. If you try to speak from your personality, from your ego, from your separated mind, nothing happens. Because you're not aligned. You're still outside the door, still operating from lack and need. And the outer world doesn't respond to separation. It responds to source. And you only access source when you go where Jesus went, inward, behind the door, into the silence that exists before thought, before identity, before the noise of your own wanting. This is why he spent 40 days in the wilderness before his ministry began. This is why he went up the mountain to pray before choosing the 12 disciples. This is why he withdrew to solitary places again and again, even when crowds were pressing in, desperate for his attention. He wasn't recharging. He wasn't resting. He was realigning. He was returning to the inner room, closing the door, and remembering who he was beyond the human personality. And every time he did, he came back with power,